Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Fireside with Founders and Leaders podcast. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Barry Pace, who is currently head of product for a company called Penfold. So today, it's all about talking to Barry, a bit about his journey, where he came from. So looking at his background from being in sort of the digital world initially, moving into product, once he sort of found his feet and tried to discover what it was that he really wanted to do. Working for companies such as Hopster, moving into to Gusto, and now working for Penfold. So looking at exploring that journey, working in different industries, what he's done to try and understand those industries as he's gone and developed his skill sets, and then how he's got into that leadership position. We also talk a bit more about some of those things that you really need to know to build a truly great product. So I can't wait for you to hear this one. So get yourselves a cup of tea, glass of wine, sit back and enjoy. So hello, Barry. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rupert. Great to be here.
No, really nice to have you on board. On what is a lovely rainy autumnal day, which, as we were just talking about off air, it's probably your favourite season.
Yeah, it is. And this morning definitely had one of those extremely damp dog walks in the dark, which I love about this time of year.
We are literally polar opposites for that. I think I'm almost affected by the sort of sad, so seasonal affective disorder, where I can feel the energy being drained out of me if there's not sunshine. So kudos to you. I wish I lived in your world sometimes, where I could just wake up on a dark, miserable day and go, yep, I love it. Not quite there. So look, other than loving autumn and sort of seasonal vegetables around this time of year, tell us a bit more about you and talk a bit more about your background. So obviously you've been in product management for quite a while, but as I find with most people, there is no traditional path to getting into product. So talk us a bit, through your sort of path and how you got into product, if you can.
Sure. Well, I'll start at the end. I'm head of product at Penfold, which is a digital pension challenger. And yeah, I've been in product for about 10 years. My route into product, I graduated from Bournemouth University on a course called Interactive Media Production that doesn't exist anymore. I think with a lot of these kind of more vocational courses, they only have a lifespan of 2 to 3 years and then they become irrelevant. They have to completely change. So graduated from Bournemouth University, and I, like many other people in my position at that time from that course, got into kind of creative digital agencies. And so kind of the route into putting our skills to use in kind of design and development and audiovisual stuff was in agencies. And that's where a lot of the jobs were. It's where the money was at that period of time. And, tech in London anyway wasn't really the kind of burgeoning industry that it has been over the last 10 years. So I kind of fell into project management in agencies and ended up doing that for 3 or 4 years. To be perfectly honest, not really focusing on my career very much, just enjoying being in my 20s in London, having a great time and not really using half of my brain really for much of it. And I kind of realized after a while working in agencies that I wasn't finding the work really intellectually that interesting. I felt like I had more to offer, but the kind of the structure of agencies was not really allowing me to progress in a way that I felt I wanted. So, things were very kind of siloed functionally, where you had creatives, strategy people, developers, project managers, and those lines were not really crossed, and your opinion was only asked for in very limited terms as a project manager anyway.
Yeah.
And so I always felt like I had something to give in the creative conversations and the strategic conversations, even with the relationship with the clients. And so I was fortunate just to find out that product management existed. I can't remember the exact moment, but it must be around 2011 that I must have read a blog post or something, or I was learning about tech stuff online through Twitter or something, probably at the time. and found out that product management existed. And I was freelance at the time, a freelance project manager working at agencies. And I started to kind of pick contracts that felt more innovative, more interesting, platform builds, these sorts of things. And it allowed me to kind of really test out a lot of the stuff that I'd been reading about in relatively low stakes environments. And yeah, was able to land my first job in a kind of an educational and ed tech mobile gaming studio. Just after that, and that was my route into product.
Nice. And the more you're talking there, you're saying sort of how you sort of transitioned into it. One of the things that we get quite a lot in terms of our industry and our job role as recruiters, when we're speaking to prospective customers who can't find the right people for product roles, is that they say they get a lot of project managers being sent to them by other people. And so it's probably a recruiter called you and told you about this. They said, "Oh, I think you're suitable for a product management role." And you went, "Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll give that a go." But there are some similarities, all jokes aside, in terms of the two roles that you're doing, especially if you're in digital project management and digital product management. Obviously, they're not the same role, but there are some similarities. So what things have you seen that you can draw upon that from the start of your career when you were in that project focused role to the now product focused role?
Yeah, I think certainly my background as a project manager to some extent has defined at least the early part of my product career and how I added value to the teams that I was part of. And I think over time, there's also been, I think, I've had a bit of a chip on my shoulder about it to some extent. I'm really big in the teams I work with now on socializing project management kind of across different roles, and varying teams respond to that in different ways. But I think in terms of at least maybe the early part of my career, and then kind of the things that I think about now in terms of project management, I think that I definitely have this idea of product managers having to fill gaps. And that was certainly the case when I was a project manager. You were a risk mitigator, really, as one of your primary functions as a project manager. You want control over your situation. And if you can maintain control of a project, then things will go as expected. Yeah. Now, obviously, in the product world, that's not as important because you can have great control over something. It can go perfectly well and you've just built the wrong thing and it's a total disaster. But there is something about that kind of control, being a risk mitigator element, which I think is really important for product management, and knowing when to deploy that and when not to. So if you've got a team who are kind of a bit unsure of themselves, maybe there's not many people are wanting to try things, or people are very much staying in their roles. As a product manager, you've got to kind of spot that and go and fill the gaps where something is missing, a particular type of thinking, a particular question being asked, a particular responsibility not being picked up. I always think that's on the product manager to be accountable for making sure that those gaps are filled, and sometimes responsible for making sure those gaps are filled.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, it's about, as you say, ensuring that there is that sort of there's that responsibility. I think that's the word it comes down to, and being responsible for whatever it is that you're building and having that ownership. You've talked about a bit more about your sort of path from being in sort of digital project management, then moving into product. You've worked at different places in different industries. So, Hopster, Gusto, and now Penfold, to name a few. So what's been your experience in terms of the transition, working across different sectors, being fairly agnostic as a product manager? How would you say that has sort of held you in sort of good stead to get to where you are now with Penfold?
Yeah, I think it probably has pros and cons, but as you can tell from my CV and my career on LinkedIn, that I've jumped around a fair bit, and I think there are some underlying kind of shared themes across any sector or any industry when it comes to doing good product management. In my opinion, maybe to flip it for a second, I think the other way to frame that is like, how important is domain knowledge in doing a really good job as a product person? And I think that domain knowledge can be built in a relatively short period of time. Not to say that domain expertise in the team and with the people you're working with, and domain expertise in the organization is often important. It's massively important.
Yeah.
But I think from a product perspective, you can kind of get away with not having it, and build that domain expertise over your first months in a role. And going between the organizations, something that you're describing there, I think you can kind of get better at it over time. The more you join in new organizations, the more jobs you have, the better you are at onboarding into those organizations and into those industries.
And how do you go about doing that then? So when you're sort of starting to work in a new industry, let's say you're going from Hopster to Gusto, right? How do you go about sort of learning a bit more about the products that you're going to be working with? It might sound like a really simple question, but I'm sure there are people out there who are going, right, it's quite a daunting thing, especially if you've come from a background as a product manager whereby you've become a product manager because you're the person who knows that product in that company. And that's why you've been promoted into this sort of product management role, and that's been perhaps your only product management role. So then the thought of going and doing it for someone else can be quite daunting. So how do you transition?
I think a lot of it depends on the context of the organization you're going into, and what you need to optimize for in your first 30, 60, 90 days, really. How important is it for you to build that domain expertise and to really deeply understand the domain, and how much is that going to influence your actions in those opening weeks and months? So I think there's probably a few things that are competing with each other. There are some kind of standard things that I would always recommend that the product people do when they join a new business, which are maybe slightly separate from the domain expertise, but you need to use your judgment as to what's needed. The first one is to understand what's there at the moment, both in terms of the team and the system that you're inheriting. And so that is all of the people within close proximity to building product and the associated stakeholders. And then also, I always try to book a good hour with a CTO or whoever the right top bod is in engineering to take me through what software do we have built, how does the system work, how do data and users flow through our system, and to understand what technology it's built on. And then and the last thing really is understanding the kind of the market of the industry. How do people make money? What is who are the competitors? Where's there been room for innovation? Where is there room for innovation? Where have things changed recently? Where do we think things going? Where is the thought leadership coming from in that industry? And trying to kind of plug yourself into that to kind of iteratively build your knowledge. So three things. One is getting to know the people, and I often do that just in a very relaxed interview introduction type style. Spending time understanding your system with your engineering folks, and then finally understanding the market. And of course, by market I also mean including the customers. So understanding both the primary research, that anything that's happened in your organization, and how they understand customers and what they understand about customers right now, and then more broadly, just customers operating in this market more generally, as well as looking at all of the things I mentioned before.
I think it's a really important thing that you mentioned there, talking about customers, right? Because it's very important that in a product role that you are speaking to your customers as well as trying to sort of understand what the business wants. So it's trying to balance the two ultimately initially of those sort of business needs, but versus the customer needs. And certainly if you're going into a business that is already established, it has customers, it's got products that are selling to those customers, whether that's B2B, B2C, or B2B2C, or whatever it might be. It's trying to understand those customers a little bit more. So how do you go about sort of setting up that that sort of understanding of the customers? Is it by getting out there and just simply speaking to them, or are there other techniques that you've got?
I'm a really big fan of Teresa Torres's continuous discovery habits. And one of the core ones of that is continuous interviewing. And I think that's just such a wonderful practice that all product people and people with close proximity to product design engineering should be taking part in on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Working your way up to talking to customers every week. And again, it depends if in this context of joining an organization, how long it's going to take you to get to that is going to depend on a number of factors. But certainly, when you first join as a product person, you want to kind of you want to set your kind of stall out culturally that customers can be a big part of this, and hopefully you've joined an organization where you'll be pushing on an open door in order to get access to customers. Sometimes that's not easy, particularly in B2B environments. It can be hard to get in front of the people who are either using your product or buying your product, and you've got to get creative.
Yep.
But you want to essentially work your way up to a consistent practice, habits of talking to customers regularly. Even if you're not entirely sure how it fits into your product development lifecycle in that moment, spend time with customers, have some structure for talking to them in a way that delivers insights.
Yep.
And the rest will go from there.
Okay, nice. And so these are some of the we're talking about some of the principles ultimately of being a product manager, some of the things that you should be doing and that are good best practice ultimately, if you like. So what do you think are some of the things that have to be ultimately done and have to be true to build a great product?
Yeah, it's a big question.
Yeah.
You're very wide and deep for this.
Yeah.
How long do you want this podcast to be?
Yeah.
But it's something I've been thinking a lot about recently, trying to, is it possible to kind of codify these sorts of things? And there is so much content out there about building products, either from a very functional view, here's what it takes to be a great product manager, which doesn't take into account, kind of cultural or like company conditions, which and the context of those, which can really make or break your ability to make to build great products. And also, I think that a lot of the content when people are trying to get into product management, they're kind of roots into accessing thought leadership or reading things. The incentives of the people who have created this content is often, for their own kind of personal brand. And oh, hey, like if I position here's how I do product and here's how you can be successful, it has a benefit for their career.
Yeah.
Not to get too meta, but maybe that's one of the reasons I'm on this podcast. You get this idea. You can build this personal brand. So anyone who's kind of reading that sort of content or absorbing that sort of content, I think should have some kind of skepticism to understand the incentives or the motives behind that stuff being written. Not to say that it is like not valuable, hugely valuable. And books are written with that in mind by authors. So lots of wonderful ideas there. It's just worth, I think, bearing in mind when you're reading this stuff. And so I think to try and then strip that away and think about, well, what are the things that really matter? I think there's probably two things for me. One is, as I've already hinted at, what are the kind of the conditions in the company? What's the organizational context? And then the other is, what are the activities that you have to do? What's the toolkit you need in order to build great products, either as a product person or as people who are responsible for building product, whether you're engineers, designers, analysts, or whatever roles are responsible in that given company context. And I think, as I said, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think there's maybe a few categories almost of things. There's the values of an organization. There's the kind of operational principles, which I think are dependent on the organizational values. And then there's like the toolkit itself.
Yeah.
And yeah, this is an incomplete, non-exhaustive list. I don't think there's a right answer here, but this is, I'd say, just a conglomeration of my experiences maybe. So highly subjective. From an organizational values perspective, I think like many people, I've read lots of kind of company values and thought, is this really adding value? If this one wasn't here, would it make a difference to how we behave?
Yeah.
And the things that I think are consistent are kind of a culture of openness and experimentation. And by experimentation, I mean in its broadest possible sense, just to try things and be
Yep.
open to trying things and not worry about, oh, this is the way that we do things.
Yep.
And secondly, psychological safety, which has been, which has, got a fair amount of traction over the last few years. And, I think popularized in tech, at least by Google, in Project Aristotle, where they showed that psychological safety was essentially the foundation for effective teams. And so if you think about those two things combined, you've got this kind of cultural openness and experimentation and psychological safety. And those are the conditions for trying things. Like you have a great cocktail for taking risks and trying things, which is the essence of innovation. So those things I think are really important. And if you're looking to get into product management or you're a product manager and those things aren't present in your organization, it's going to be really hard for you to do a good job. Even if you're a great product manager or you've got the potential to be an awesome product manager, if those things aren't true, it's going to be really hard for you to really achieve your best. And there aren't many companies like that. So it's I guess I would just say to anyone who's maybe struggling or feels a bit down on themselves about like their role or the nature of the work they do, it's quite rare, and I don't think you'd get that impression from listening to podcasts and reading books a lot of the time. But
everything's always great in the books, isn't it? Like everything's great on the podcast. Like there's no bullshit. There's no politics. You don't have to deal with any of it. Everything's fine. And yeah, I love everything I do. And that's not the reality of. That's just not the reality of the world ultimately. And I think there's some really interesting stuff that we're now sort of delving deep into the world of psychology, but some stuff that I've sort of listened to about how we look at perhaps sometimes beating ourselves up around sort of decisions we make and things we do, and the way that we treat ourselves comparatively to the way we might treat other people. One of the podcasts that I listen to is it's called the High Performance Podcast. Much more professional than this, but they had I guess, and I can't remember his name, but he was talking about how when you're going and you've got a problem and you've got a friend who's got a problem, and they tell you they've got a problem, you'll often put an arm around them and get them to talk about their problems and say, let's go for a drink or something, and let's have a chat about it. Whereas individually we'll probably go, oh, come on, just crack on. Don't worry about it. Just get your head down. And, oh, no, why are you being so stupid about this? You're not worthy, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really interesting that that you talk about that as being part of that sort of product mindset and having that sort of safety mechanism, as you sort of put it, in place, and having that sort of view in a business. So I just wanted to explore how you can try and achieve that in terms of that psychological sort of safety that you talked about. How do you achieve that? Because it's great to say, let's go and do it, but how do you implement it?
Yeah, I think to begin with, it's worth understanding where he's starting from. And I think you can do that from getting a sense of the organization. You can kind of observe how people work together, the dynamics in meetings, those sorts of things. And also with surveys. So, you can craft a survey which allows you to kind of understand how much psychological safety is there in this organization. It's worth actually pausing for a second and talking about exactly what psychological safety is, just in 30 seconds. Psychological safety is essentially, and it can be a number of different things from different angles, but largely it's about being comfortable being your whole self, in this case at work, in a group. So it starts with like your identity, so comfortable being who you are and as a person outside of work professionally. That could be race, gender, disability, or whatever. You don't feel like you need to hide those things. You don't feel you need to change the way you speak at work, those sorts of things. It's a very kind of fundamental part of psychological safety. And then there's this idea of being able to kind of challenge things. So if someone who's more senior than me has said, I love this idea, it's fantastic, it's great for all these reasons, and in your head you're thinking, that's absolutely terrible. You're comfortable saying, oh, hey, like I hear you're saying this, but I think this, and this. If you keep that inside your head rather than saying it out loud to that person, that would be some absence of psychological safety in that setting. So you've got kind of the identity part of it, this kind of challenger part of it. And then thirdly, the idea to kind of contribute your own ideas, to put them out there for critique as well. So not just challenging other people's ideas, but to put yours out there as well for critique. And if and then you get feedback on those things, and it doesn't absolutely crush you if someone goes, oh, hey, I'm not sure about that for these reasons. It's like, oh, okay, no worries. You tried. And in Project Aristotle, I'm going to butcher this. I haven't read it for ages, but there was a New York Times article about it, which talked about how they pulled together a group of people who maybe weren't as high performers, but they worked really well together, and they were a more effective team than people who were, seemed to be the absolute top of their field, but didn't communicate as effectively and didn't have those psychological safe conditions because they trusted each other's expertise too much. So the psychological safety of like speaking over each other and interrupting to kind of check people's thinking is really helpful. So once you've kind of tested the ground for what is the psychological safety like in an organization, you want to start to try and cultivate it if it's absent or it's not, or if it's not great. And there is no shortcut to that, really. It is difficult. It's about building great foundational relationships with people around you, understanding what are the barriers for people feeling safe in an environment, and then change those things. And sometimes that can be stuff that, particularly in companies, and people don't like, or are often off on the side as like side projects, on like diversity, equity, and inclusion is happening over here in the people team, but in your team where you're trying to build a great environment for innovation, you've got a problem right there that's staring you in the face, and you need to address it on those terms. And I think that's something that people don't have great tools for, and I certainly don't think I have a solution for. It's a really hard problem, and it does depend on the situation.
I think sounds like there's obviously an element as well of the people that you have as part of the team, because everyone needs to take their own responsibility ultimately to play their part in creating that environment. And if you've got people that are not prepared to do that, and as you said, they gave the example of those people who are solo sports people or team players. The team players are the ones that are going to be able to create that. If you've got a great group of people who individually are amazing, it doesn't build that environment, because they will often just go head down and focus on themselves.
Yeah, and I spoke about this from the context of like the organizational culture, and the responsibility for that is the people in power. So it's normally the people who are leading the business, the leaders of the business, and in any kind of smaller situation, who has the power in that dynamic. So sometimes it's the product manager, even though they don't have maybe the kind of the real kind of hierarchical power in the organization in that instance. Often they're kind of the facilitator. And I always say to people in my team and to people who are getting to management that you've got to be this kind of shameless cheerleader, and you've got to shed all kind of shame about anything that you do, in a positive way, to just not be afraid of embarrassing yourselves or putting yourself out there. And just by modeling that behavior, you can help cultivate a more psychologically safe environment, because you're showing that you're not like, you're not infallible, and you get things wrong, and everything's not so serious all the time. Very important part, I think, of not just leadership in general, but of being a product manager.
And so, talking there of leadership, so you sort of transitioned into leadership. I'm assuming during your time at Gusto, you managed to sort of make that transition from being a product manager to more of a lead role, now as a head of Penfold, as we discussed earlier. So how did you sort of go about trying to make that transition from that sort of more individual contributor role into a leadership role, and what challenges did you come across when you were doing it?
Yeah, I had to sort of dip my toe into product leadership in at least one previous role at Hopster. So I've have and maybe one other line management experience from prior to that. So largely as a IC product manager through my product career, but occasional kind of random forays into either kind of a mix between IC and a manager of product managers, or just that. And yes, and largely my transition from IC to leadership was at Gusto. The biggest challenges that I face, I think to begin with, and it's a challenge that I'd struggled with for my entire career, was I think I'd probably summarize it as stakeholder management and alignment. It was not a strength of mine at all. I think because I'd made the mistake that many product people do, where I'd read Marty Kagan and I thought I knew everything and tried to, and I didn't, and tried to kind of make it work. And when people kind of disagreed or thought, well, what about this? Or, that's not going to work here, or you just need to go and build this. I didn't have anything to.
They're going, but the book says.
Exactly. In my head, I was like, oh, they're wrong because Marty Kagan says this. But I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to fix it. And that kind of weakness was kind of really part of me being a product person for many years. And I was really fortunate at Gusto to work with some people who were just very good at that and who I really love working with, and massively trusted and respected. And getting my feet under the table at Gusto for a long period of time allowed me to really learn from those people. I think in particular, probably name drop Dominic Sando, who was my head of product at the time at Gusto. And I learned so much from him on how to really just understand the motivations of people around me and empathize with them, understand what they're looking for to be, what are they trying to do to be successful? How do they be successful and how can I help them be successful? And although that's not really a great way to shape your entire way of being a product manager or product leader, it is important context to take into account. So that was one challenge that I faced, and got, I often got feedback through my career that was an area that I was struggling with. And I think I've probably turned a corner on that by now, I hope. And so, that's probably my biggest challenge, to kind of overcome that. And again, really fortunate at Gusto, I had a really wonderful environment for growing people. And so, hugely benefited from that. And culminated in becoming a group product manager there, which was awesome.
Nice. It's often the way, isn't it? Surrounding yourself with good people, picking up from them, asking them, okay, well, what do you think I need to work on? But then not just hearing it, actually then working on it and trying to implement it, and doing your bit to get better at some of those points. And as you say, often is around trying to ensure that you can get the best out of others around you. And in terms of your job role now, in terms of the differences from being that individual contributor role to a head of, for you, what are the core differences in your sort of day-to-day role, and how do you sort of push things forward to whatever's next?
I think one of the great things about being a product leader is that you don't really have to give up a lot of the really cool IC stuff. As long as you can find the balance with your team, that you're not like being overbearing and they've got space to be autonomous and they have control over their own team, you can kind of still contribute your ideas. And often it's great to bounce things around with different people. And so I often find myself being the person who's being bounced off, if that makes sense, from a varying degree, not just from the product managers, but from engineering managers, other leaders around the business. So I think that's probably the biggest shift, is at least in an environment that is quite autonomous, where you want a lot of bottom-up strategy, bottom-up solutions, that you're kind of helping people with the things they're already doing and coaching, building, supporting short feedback loops to improve things. If I think about my time as an IC product manager, there's a lot more structure. There's a lot more day-to-day, minute-to-minute dependencies on you. So you're kind of, your die is cast in terms of how your week's going to go. And really, as a product manager, I think it's a really great way to frame your role around what does my weekly cadence look like? What are the different sessions that I'm doing? What is the different focus time blocks that I have, and what am I going to get done in those times? Much more kind of restricted, really. Not necessarily in a bad way, but it's just the way it's got to be when you're working in a cross-functional team. And then as a product leader, there's a little bit more give in that routine. And so I think it's really good practice to kind of maintain that structure in some way. It's often got more flexibility, but ensuring that you're really working on the things where you can have the most impact for the business as a whole. And it depends on the size of the organization. Often that's through empowering your team and helping your team get better and into high performance. Sometimes it's helping with operating model things and ensuring the way that we work together between the different functions is better. Sometimes it's supporting on, top level business strategy things. At a company I'm at now, Penfold, we're about sort of 50, 60 people. It's kind of a mix of all of those things.
Yeah, it tends to be in that size business that you're sort of mixing all of them together and doing what's most important at the time. Ultimately, aren't you? You just got to balance everything and work out. Okay, well, at the moment we need to focus on this because it's more important than that, essentially. So look, you've been really open and giving some great advice, but I'd like to ask you one last question. If you were to sort of look back at sort of, I suppose, sort of where you've sort of come from and where you are now, what would you give as one bit of advice to anyone who's sort of coming up in the product world, specifically if they're either coming up from a more junior role or into a sort of looking to get into a more senior role, that you think would perhaps sort of help them along the way? If you were looking back, maybe even at your younger self when you were sort of floating around like London, using half your brain, your words, not mine. What would you say to try and sort of help give you a better career trajectory or continue your trajectory as to where it is now?
I think the number one thing is, I was thinking as you're talking, just finding a mentor, someone who you look at. Maybe haven't got the exact role that you want, or that you don't follow their exact career path, but someone who has some experience, has some great judgment, has seen some things, and can help you navigate the early stages of your career, or your early stages of your career, or a career switch. And failing an individual mentor, because sometimes individuals are fallible, and maybe you might get some bad advice from it if it's just one person. Finding some community and networking, you can kind of bounce these things around and build up a very broad picture of your decisions and how good they are to encourage those feedback loops. And I think it's one thing that I didn't do. I think in the early stage of my product career, I didn't engage so much with the community. I mean, there wasn't that much of a product community around at that time, but there was some. And I didn't really have a mentor beyond, like, outside of the roles that I had. And so I didn't have this kind of consistent support over years and years, which I think I've felt like I've gained more as I've built my network towards the later part of my career. And I just think, if I'd had that, 10 years ago, I think I would have been able to, if I wanted to, I think I would have been able to accelerate my career much faster. And so I think to some extent I try to be that person for the people in my teams now, as best I can. And I think it's certainly a really important part of developing your craft as a product person.
Definitely. And it's a lot easier now. I don't want to make it sound like sort of dinosaurs, but there's mentorship programs that are out there now that weren't there before. So you can go and you can speak to various people. You don't have to cold approach random people and say, "Will you be my mentor, please?" Because there are people out there who are prepared to do it. And actually, you'll find that even if you do go and approach people in a sort of a cold approach, most people are willing to help. And actually, most people will be flattered. And if you can be of the mindset of if someone says like, "No, I don't have time," don't worry about it. It's nothing personal. It's just that they just don't have the time to do it, or maybe they've got other mentees that they sort of focus on. So keep going. I think it's a really solid bit of advice, and certainly something that I hope other people will be able to pick up on, so that they can accelerate their careers even further. So thank you very much for that. Well, look, we've reached the end of our time, Barry, so it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for coming and talking so openly about so many things. I'm sure it's going to be a big help to a lot of people out there listening to it. So thank you again, and I look forward to hopefully catching up with you to have some pumpkin soup or something soon.
Thanks, Rupert.